On everybody, to me from Team Tech here, back again with another video for you guys. Today I'm going to be talking about two devices that a lot of us as students or content creators are debating on which is best for us and our ideal needs when it comes to getting work done, productivity, or video editing, photo editing, for browsing the web, reading ebooks, media consumption. I'm going to be comparing the MacBook Pro M1 with the iPad Pro 12.9-inch 2020 with the Magic Keyboard, since we're talking about laptops here, and the iPad Pro can only be a laptop replacement if you have the keyboard with it, with the trackpad. So we're going to talk about the differences in design and video editing, photo editing, workflow, real life use. I'll talk about some specs in the beginning to get you guys familiar with the devices if you are not familiar with them by now, and we'll just get into it from there. So if you like this kind of content, hit that like button, subscribe, hit that bell icon, because I make more content like this comparing devices that may be useful for you as a student or a content creator, and I go over some other tech stuff. Just browse the channel and check it out. All right, let's get into it. So the iPad Pro that I have with me is the 12.9-inch variant, and you can see that these two devices are almost similar in size. However, the aspect ratio is very different, which plays a factor in a few things. The iPad Pro has a 4:3 aspect ratio, 4:3 aspect ratio, which gives it more of a square dimension, which is great for reading ebooks or watching old school anime that is used in this aspect ratio. Media that is 16.9 or 21:9 will suffer larger letterboxing, and it will seem like there is a huge waste of screen real estate. For media consumption, as most YouTube videos and movies are filmed in this aspect ratio, with some films in 21:9 or some YouTubers using 18:9, which either way you'll use some screen real estate compared to the 4:3 from the iPad Pro. If you're using the MacBook for writing notes and reading books, it's still pleasant since text is still very crisp, as the MacBook has a high resolution of 2560 by 1600 and 227 pixels per inch, though the iPad Pro has a high resolution of 2732 by 2048 with 264 pixels per inch, but we'll talk more about that when we get into the displays. MacBook Pro has a wide color P3 gamut for excellent colors and an IPS panel, which also is known for displaying colors at their best. Colors are usually best displayed on IPS panels compared to TN and VA panels, and the MacBook Pro maxes out at 500 nits, which is slightly different than the iPad Pro, which is maxed out at 600 nits. The iPad Pro also has a 120 Hz ProMotion display, while the MacBook Pro only has 60 Hz, and you'll notice that this screen is not as smooth as the iPad Pro. I won't bore you with any more specs on how this performs, and so let's get into how it performs in real world use, what are the main differences, and which is a better bang for your buck. So the first difference between these two that I want to talk about is the speakers. The speakers on these are quite different. The iPad Pro has 4 speakers, 2 on the front and 2 on the back, and they get really, really loud. At 50% volume, you'll be more than satisfied with the volume that's coming out of the iPad Pro. Whereas the MacBook Pro, it has high dynamic audio, which is supposed to be really good and really accurate, and compared to the iPad Pro, the volume levels are night and day. At 50% volume, I could barely hear the MacBook Pro compared to the iPad Pro. And this is kind of something I'm not that happy about. I don't like how at 50% volume, the MacBook Pro is still very quiet.
I can't hear you!
Aye, Captain!
Oh!
Like, I'd have to crank the MacBook Pro to 80, 95% just to match 60% volume on the iPad Pro. And the iPad Pro doesn't distort when it gets that loud, so I'm not sure why Apple made the MacBook Pro lower volume. And I've seen on other videos of the MacBook Air is actually a little louder than the iPad Pro if you look at Mac's tech videos when they compare the two models. So I'm not sure what was going on with that. I'm not too happy about it, but
Whack.
at the same time, I do use headphones a lot when I'm consuming music or media on my MacBook Pro, so it's not that bad. It's not a deal breaker by any means. The speakers still sound really, really good when you're in a very quiet room, but if there's noise around you, you will have to crank this up quite a bit, almost 100%, just to enjoy the sound that's coming from the MacBook Pro. But the sound is good, don't get me wrong. It's just not that loud from my experience, which kind of sucks being a Pro model and how much you pay for it, you know? So I'm gonna do a little speaker test for you guys so that way you can see the difference in sound quality and volume when comparing the two MacBook Pro and the iPad Pro 12.9 inch 2020.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways.
50%. Let's see how it sounds.
Only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul. Walking alone, the streets are empty. The only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around.
Back at 100%. So 100%.
The sky, we are heroes tonight. Yeah. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight.
Sound fairly quiet compared to what you're about to hear at 100% and 75% from the iPad Pro. Let's see. 100%.
Protect your soul. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Yeah. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight.
So as you can see, a very clear difference between the two in volume levels. No distortion with the iPad Pro to me, and no distortion in the MacBook Pro, but I think I prefer something that can get a little louder, don't you? For a student or a content creator or a researcher or anything like that, web browsing between these two, the experience is pretty similar when you're browsing through Safari, at least. If you're using Safari on the iPad Pro, you get a desktop experience. Everything loads up as if you were using a desktop, and it's pretty much seamless from there. Google Docs, if you're doing Google Docs and you do a lot of documenting or word processing through there, you still get Google Docs through the basic desktop area. But if you use Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge or any other browser in the iPad Pro, it will default you to the Google Docs app, or say the browser isn't compatible. So there's a workaround with that. You can click on the Google Docs thing and have it open as a new tab, and then you should be able to use the desktop version of Google Docs. But other than that, you'd have to use Safari to just get into Google Docs without trying to make those little workarounds. Whereas obviously on the MacBook Pro, using a desktop OS, you're gonna be able to use Google Docs just fine. So with web browsing, it's a pretty similar experience, especially if you're using Safari. And you really can't go wrong with either one because they both have very powerful processors. They both have the latest Wi-Fi 6. So web browsing on there is pretty good, and scrolling through the web through both devices is pretty fast. And scrolling through the web is going to be a lot more smoother with the iPad Pro, given it has the 120 Hz display. So those are the differences between the two with web browsing. It's not that different. When it comes to word processing, things get a little different. With the iPad Pro, when you're word processing on things like Microsoft Word, you do get the full experience almost, but not quite, because it's not the desktop app. But you still get quite a bit in the app itself. That's for the iPad. So you can still use word processing stuff for school or content creation, script writing, screenwriting. You can do plenty of stuff in the Microsoft Word app on the iPad. I've gotten some schoolwork done on the iPad Microsoft Word. It's totally fine. But the desktop one on the MacBook Pro obviously will be better since you get to utilize Microsoft Word as a whole into its fullest potential. When you're typing and you're selecting text, it's different on the iPad Pro because it has the same feel as if you are texting, and we have to hold the screen or use the trackpad, and just selecting text is kind of difficult on the iPad compared to the MacBook, just because of that iOS experience when it comes to selecting text compared to the desktop experience selecting text. I have to show you on the screen to show you what I'm talking about, but those of you who have used the iPad Pro and done word processing on it, you'll know what I'm talking about. So word processing on here is totally fine on both devices. You'll just get more of the desktop and whole experience and using apps to their potential on the MacBook. So when it comes to productivity, I do prefer the MacBook over the iPad Pro, especially when it comes to multitasking. When it comes to multitasking, I do prefer the ability to have lots of windows open at once. Although the MacBook does have that same split screen experience that's similar to the iPad where you split the screens in half, I don't like that. I prefer how Windows does it, where you can have the four corners used and you can slide the window and it'll automatically have that window take up half the screen or a quarter of the screen if you're going for quadrants. So when it comes to multitasking, definitely the MacBook Pro wins, hands down. File management, MacBook Pro, hands down. The iPad Pro's file management system has been okay, but importing media and large files takes a very long time, and it still doesn't show you quite how much time is left when importing media that are large, like large video files, for example. It won't show you how much time is left compared to the MacBook. So MacBook file system is still way better than the iPad Pro, even though it's come a long way. So if you're a content creator, video editing, how does both devices handle video editing? Handles it pretty well, actually. The iPad Pro is a very powerful device. You can render 4K videos, and I believe even 8K videos on the iPad Pro. Though I don't know anyone who's doing 8K videos right now and uploading on YouTube, considering the file size and how long it will take to upload that video. But the iPad Pro is no slouch, especially if you download a very powerful app called LumaFusion, which I believe is only $30. I've edited a lot of my videos on LumaFusion in the past, before I got the MacBook, and it works phenomenal. You were able to do HDR 10-bit. I just put out an update for HDR 10-bit, especially when recording videos from the iPhone 12s and their Dolby Vision formats. You can do a lot with LumaFusion. You can add story blocks on there. Storyblocks is integrated in there, but you have to subscribe to it. But you still get that Storyblocks integration to add footage and sound effects. It's very powerful. It renders videos very fast in real time. I've uploaded or rendered 10-minute videos, and they've rendered in less than 10 minutes, which is phenomenal. It's very fast, very efficient. Nice exporting settings on there. The export settings are really good on LumaFusion. You can select your bit rate. You can select the codec that you want. It's really good. I'm not sure if you can export in ProRes or anything like that, but you can definitely export in H.264 and 265. I know that for sure. And that's the only thing I do use is H.264 because it just works for me. Can't upload our Apple ProRes. I mean, I can, but I don't have the patience for that. I don't know anybody that does, because Apple ProRes files are very big. But you do have, if you don't want to spend $30 on LumaFusion, you can use Adobe Rush, Cyberlink Pro. There's a lot of options you can use. So editing on the iPad Pro, it can be done. It can be your only workhorse for starting a YouTube channel and editing your video. You can even just use an iPhone, because the LumaFusion is also on the iPhone. All these other apps are also on the iPhone. You can do all that stuff straight from the iPhone, and you will be just fine starting a YouTube channel or just general content creation. The editing on the MacBook Pro, obviously you get a lot of different powerful desktop apps, and this is where the differences between the iPad Pro and MacBook Pro really shine out, is using desktop apps in general. I don't use anything like Xcode, but I know Xcode is something that you can only use on the desktop for my coders out there. And Photoshop, obviously you get the full benefits of that. Even though it's on the iPad Pro, you get the full benefits of Photoshop on the desktop app. Lightroom is actually good on both devices, so that works just fine. But Adobe Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, obviously Final Cut, Motion Compressor, After Effects, Media Encoder, all those are desktop apps that you cannot find on the iPad Pro. So if you really want to get deep into video editing and use the most effects and use your video editing to its utmost potential, I would recommend the MacBook Pro, hands down. There's no competition there. I use Final Cut Pro now. I'm getting used to that since it's my first time with a MacBook. I'm using Final Cut Pro, and that's what I've been using to edit this video right now that you're watching, is edited on Final Cut Pro. I do use Adobe Premiere Pro, and I'm using them on my desktop now and then, depending on what I want to do with my video. I haven't really tried DaVinci Resolve yet. I'm still trying to get into that and learn it, and probably make some videos about it once I master it at some point. But so far I'm trying to master Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere. And on the M1 MacBook, Adobe Premiere still doesn't have a native app, so it still has some hiccups here and there, and rendering will be nowhere near as fast as it is on Final Cut Pro. So right now Final Cut Pro is the go-to for the M1 MacBook, but you can still use Adobe Premiere Pro on the M1 MacBooks. It just won't be as smooth and it won't render as fast as Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve is the same thing. So when it comes to video editing and rendering speeds, definitely in the M1 MacBook Pro, hands down, if you want to do some content creation. But you can still use the iPad Pro. You just won't have that desktop experience, all those desktop apps. But I swear to God, LumaFusion, you can still do a lot of great work on there. And it's not really about the app or the desktop app. I mean, sure, you can get the most out of the desktop apps. It's really about your creativity and how you put out that content and how you edit your stuff. You can still do a lot of great work depending on how you use the app. So when it comes to video editing and media or content creation, you can go no wrong with both devices. But if you want the ultimate experience, MacBook Pro. iPad Pro, I believe, has 6 GB of RAM, but if you are familiar with iOS and the operating system, they don't need that much RAM to operate very efficiently and keep apps open in the background and etc. The M1 MacBooks come with 8 GB of RAM and 16 GB of RAM, and if you're an everyday user and you're not doing a lot of heavy load work on your MacBook, you won't go wrong with 8 GB of RAM. But if you're like me, a content creator, and you work with videos and you have a lot of tabs open, you're researching, doing schoolwork, no brainer, 16 GB of RAM is what you should get. And if you're trying to debate between storage and RAM, definitely always get the RAM, because you can always invest in an external hard drive that's just as fast as the internal hard drive if you're investing in NVMe external hard drives, or you're getting the SanDisk Extreme Pro or the Samsung T7, which can go up to 1050 megabyte read speed. So if you get the T7 or some NVMe or SanDisk, you won't go wrong, because you can upgrade your storage up to 2 terabytes with those things and not pay that Apple tax of almost damn near $800 just to upgrade your storage, which is completely stupid and a ripoff. The internal SSDs on here are very powerful and fast, but that's just a ripoff to charge you that much to upgrade to at least 2 terabytes of storage. So when it comes to storage and all that stuff, speaking of, now we're talking about that actually, 128 gigabytes is where you are starting out with the iPad Pro, and 256 is where you start out with the MacBooks, and the MacBooks go up to 2 terabytes, the iPad Pro can go up to 1 terabyte. Now we're talking about storage and stuff like that. But yeah, when it comes to RAM, definitely get 16 gigabytes of RAM if you're a content creator and do a lot of heavy loads, but 8 gigabytes of RAM should be plenty fine for the MacBook Pro. When you're doing heavy video editing, there is some swap here and there, but it's fine. Don't worry about that. Okay, moving on. Portability and ease of use. If you are a Windows user or an Android user, you've never used these devices before, you will be just fine. The iPad is easy to learn. iOS is not that complicated I mean, Android honestly is more complicated because you can do more with it. You can do more customizations and fix things to how you want it to be, which makes it more complicated if you don't know what you want to do with it. With iOS, it lays it all out for you. Not that much customizing to go. You just got to learn how to open stuff up and close it and switch between stuff and learn gestures, yada yada. Not that hard. Now, if you're coming from Windows, you're going to Mac OS, which is me. I was Windows for the longest time. Never had Mac OS ever in my life. It took a while to learn. I don't know what the hell Finder was, and Finder is pretty much similar to Library, or yeah, Finder's pretty much the same as Library on your desktop on Windows, or you can see your disk drives, your storage, your downloads. That's pretty much what Finder is on Mac OS. And then all the apps having the dock, that's pretty easy to find. And then Finder pretty much has everything on there. If you want to find your apps and all that stuff. And just learning the shortcuts on Mac was the hardest thing for me. Learning how to find hidden folders and all this hidden stuff where extra storage is being used and I don't know where it is and I want to delete it. So I'm still learning Mac OS, but I've come to learn it pretty easily. So once I master it, I'll make a video on how to navigate Mac OS for those of you who don't know how to do it yet, like me, for example, when I first got this MacBook. So user experience is pretty easy when it comes to iPad OS and Mac OS. You can learn it really quickly. Now, portability, the iPad Pro with Magic Keyboard is just as heavy as the MacBook Pro, if not maybe a little heavier. But when you take the iPad off the keyboard, obviously it's more portable than the MacBook Pro. I have a hard shell case on my MacBook Pro to protect it from scratches and whatnot in case I want to resell it or trade it in for the 16-inch MacBook Pro that might have the M1 or M1X chip, whatever they want to call it. I know I'm going to be wanting to upgrade to that when it comes out because I just want the ultimate experience when it comes to Mac OS and editing and content creation. So portability, you won't go wrong with either or. They're pretty much the same size. You have the Magic Keyboard, but bear in mind the iPad Pro 12.9 is already pretty pricey at $999, I believe, to start out at the base model. And the MacBook Pro at the base, I believe, is $1,200. I'll put a correction on the screen if I'm wrong, but it's around $1,200, $1,300 at the base storage and base RAM. So when it comes to and when you add the Magic Keyboard to the iPad Pro, it's I wish, $329, I believe. So that pretty much makes it equal to the MacBook Pro, a little slightly cheaper. So when it comes to that, you got to ask yourself, do I want a tablet, laptop experience? And if you want the Magic Pencil, it's another $129. So it will be just as much as the MacBook Pro for the full set of the iPad Pro. It's a complete laptop replacement. So you got to ask yourself, do you want a tablet, the pencil, and the Magic Keyboard where you can detach and all that stuff and get pretty much every app known to man since it's an iPad OS? Or do you want the whole desktop experience, the most powerful apps you can use, the most efficient way to be productive? So it's up to you and what your needs are. As a student content creator, I prefer the MacBook because I like using the desktop apps and I prefer the ultimate experience. But if you can't go wrong with the iPad, so if you do a lot of sketching, you'll like to write your notes, and you do a lot of creative stuff more so on that side, I would recommend the iPad Pro. Because price-wise, these are basically almost the same when you include the keyboard and the pencil and all that stuff. So, and also, I gotta add in, if you do like social media on the iPad Pro, there are some apps that aren't optimized and you will have to rotate the screen, and they're very small. They don't fill up the screen at all. That's Instagram, and I don't know why you'd Snapchat on the iPad, but Instagram definitely needs some work on the iPad. So, hopefully this video helped you out and helped you decide on which device is best for you, the iPad Pro or the MacBook Pro M1. So hopefully I helped you make some kind of decision on here. Ultimately for me, I do prefer doing productivity stuff on my MacBook, and I like using the iPad for some sidecar stuff. You can use sidecar with the MacBook and the iPad if you want to have both and have two screens basically working together, but I got plenty of screens all around me right now, so the iPad I do use if I want to write some notes or write with my pencil or do a little media consumption just holding my stuff on the side. So yeah, hopefully this helped you make a decision. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, hit that bell icon. Stay tuned for my next video, and take care. Peace.